My name is John Lobell. I'm professor of architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. This is a lecture from the course History and Theory of Architecture, Fall 2015. This is lecture 2, What is History?
And again, as I'm going to talk about in this lecture, this is the first of 4 semesters. It's going to survey architecture from the beginning until today. We go up till the 1800s in this year, and then second year, you have a somewhat different team, and you go to up till today. So our first several lectures are an overview of what our approach is. But during this overview, we're going to look at all the material we're going to be seeing so that you sort of have a sense of, where we're coming from and where we're going. I'm the type that I don't read movie reviews before I see the movie. I don't want to know what it's about. Let the movie tell me. But here we want to sort of have a sense of where we are and where we're going. Now, I'm going to apologize for presenting a lot of material, and if you can't get notes on all of it, that's okay, as again, this is sort of an overview, but I'm going to start in part 1 with the question, what is history? And there's an easy but difficult answer to that. So, of course, history is a record of what happened, but what's the problem? Do you ever hear the phrase, the map cannot fully correspond to the territory? In other words, if you made a map of New York that showed every detail of New York, it would be the size of New York. It would be New York. I'm just showing the streets. Or I'm just showing the streets and outlines of the buildings, as Google starts to put that into their maps. But although now Google and Apple are competing to map the insides of buildings, right? So this, we can flow in and out. But still, we have to select. We have to decide what we're going to include and what we're not going to include. And our selection reflects a bias or point of view. And recently we tend to use the terms power and gender. There's a phrase about military history that the history is told by the victors. The ones that win the war write the history of what happened. And, there are other points of view. And culture, your needs. We're going to oversimplify some stuff and then get maybe into more detail later as you go through the curriculum here. And finally, very interestingly, our architectural culture today, what we think important today influences how we look at the past. So when I was a student, the textbook from about, let's say 1949 till about 1970, the modern architectural textbook was Space-Time and Architecture by Siegfried Giedion. He covers the 19th and 20th centuries, and there's no mention of Beaux-Arts architecture. For example, the Metropolitan Museum, Beaux-Arts architecture in New York would include 42nd Street Library, Grand Central Station. That was all a mistake, according to Giedion. And so we'll skip that and get to the real stuff. Well, today we do include it. Interestingly, in the Metropolitan Museum, you go to the section where the Impressionist paintings are, late 19th century painting, and 40 years ago, the academic painting of that period was in the basement. Now it's in the same area, all mixed in. So and that doesn't mean either approach is the correct one, it's our way we feel today affects what we include and don't include. When I was a student, the architect Antonio Gaudí was not in the textbooks. He was in books called Fantastic Architecture. Today, he's one of the most important modern architects. He's in all the textbooks. So this, again, this changes. In the late 60s, there began to be, along with second wave feminism, a consciousness of women in architecture, and a major exhibit was mounted at the Brooklyn Museum. And the catalog for that was a book by Susanna Torrey, Women in American Architecture. Totally new awareness. Oh, hey, wow, there's all this other stuff. And then the political issue. Do we include women because they have something different to offer, or are women just like men in the way they design? And that becomes a cultural, political discussion. Building like Monticello by Thomas Jefferson. This might have been the way we looked at it 50 years ago. And maybe today we say, you know, it's not just a building, it's an entire working plantation. It's an area of production, which includes slavery in terms of the way the production worked. So there we have a somewhat different view of it than we might have had previously. In the 1950s, modern architecture was dominated by the international style. Famous example, Philip Johnson's glass house of 1949. And that sort of dictated what a house should look like. It should be a glass box or a white box, depending upon where you were coming from, Mies or Gropius and Corbu. But in 1964, Robert Venturi does this. And so maybe we should go back and look at shingle style, which we had skipped previously in our historical approach. So we sort of have a history of history, you know, that so we select, there's a bias, our biases change. So that was part one. Part two, we're going to do a brief survey of what we're going to see over these next 2 years. And this is kind of repetitive with what Meredith did last week, but it won't hurt to sort of keep looking at this stuff and absorbing it. Once in a while, we get transfer students who, you know, we have to figure out what did they cover in their previous school. And I remember arguing with the students, well, I had Renaissance. And I'm thinking, you know, my colleague is giving this Renaissance lecture. I'm seeing a lecture on the Renaissance over 40 years by 10 different colleagues. I'm still learning. You know, this is great stuff. So it doesn't hurt to see it again. And I'm just going to begin here with Paleolithic. Paleo means old, lithic stone, so old Stone Age. And there's a little tricky issue here. This is the Terramata house in France, 300,000 BC. What's problematic about that date? Does that ring any kind of bell? Oh, first of all, just in case anybody's not familiar, we used to say BC and AD. So BC was before Christ and AD was Anno Domini, and we're in 2015 AD. And then there became a fashion maybe 20 years ago to say BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. So CE and AD mean the same thing, and BC and BCE mean the same thing. And if you look at different books, they're both used interchangeably. But what's up with this date? Homo sapiens, us, emerge around 100,000 BC. So this is 200,000, this is a fifth of a million years before modern human beings even emerged. So lots of interesting things going on here. But we have poles, a ridge beam, a slope shape for the house, a hearth using fire. And I like to play around with these ideas. Here we are, the house I showed you by Robert Venturi, and it very strongly symbolizes the sloped roof and the chimney. And that image is, if you ask any child to draw a house, this is maybe what they'll draw. So the elements that we associate, sloped roof, the hearth, are there already a third of a million years ago. So think about this older stuff sort of impacts our consciousness to this day. Here we are, now we have fully emerged human beings. 15 to 10,000 BCE, caves of Lascaux. When these were first discovered, they said, this art's so sophisticated, it's got to be forgeries. And now we recognize that our ancestors, some of them were very capable artists. And then we look at the Neolithic period, And something interesting happens here. We get settled villages, so everything changes. We move from hunter-gatherers to settled villages, and we get pottery, metallurgy, textiles. So let's pretend this is a ceramic coffee cup, this is a metal laser printer, and this is a cotton shirt. They were doing all that. So those technologies are already developed, the key technologies that we're still using today. They didn't have the smartphone yet, but they had a lot of other stuff. Now, once you have settled villages, a whole bunch of stuff happens. And Meredith showed you Çatal Hüyük. Very interesting chapel is found there. Talk about this in a couple of weeks. These are women's breasts with the nipples being negative and vultures' beaks inside them. This is a goddess figure giving birth to bulls. So, and we're going to find a lot of those traditions are still with us to this day. Some magnificent relationships to nature, this period reflected in the United States. This is Mesa Verde, 1100 to 1300 CE. Now, we're going to see the concept of a cultural period as opposed to a date. So here is 6000 BCE, here we are 1000 plus. So this is 7,000 years later, but the same culture. So in Europe, it's building Gothic cathedrals at this point, but here we've got this stuff nestled into the great cliffs. Neolithic period is a period of megaliths, mega, big stones. Most famous one is Stonehenge, but some very important other ones we'll look at. And we see astronomical alignments, people paying attention to how we fit into, relate to the what's going on in the heavens. And then we get the emergence of high civilizations. And the key thing here is large-scale agriculture. So this then makes possible wealth, large populations, surplus. The amount of labor needed for the food is now less, leaving people free to do other things like make large-scale architecture. Now, the moment you have large-scale agriculture, I mean thousands of acres under cultivation, a series of things happen. You have irrigation. That means engineering. You get property. So, well, if I plant this crop, I get to harvest it. Yours is over there. That means surveying, which is also engineering. We've got to know when to plant and when to harvest. So we get calendar, astronomy. Then we get specialization. Okay, certain people build the irrigation, certain people do the farming, and certain people organize everything. That's called the government. They take half of all of it for themselves. And we get writing to keep track of all these records, which then leads to records and then history. And then we get the emergence of theocratic nation states. That means they're religiously based empires, all the elements of statecraft, including laws and standing armies, and syncretic religion. We'll talk about that, but that's religions that are put together to serve a kind of nation-state purpose. So, a high civilization is a very specific thing, and it leads to an enslavement of human beings. You've got to milk that cow every morning at 6 every day of your life. You know, I got to wander off for 3 months and think about my novel. Nope, the cow will be dead when you get back. You are tied into that system. And then with industrialization, it sort of still uses that kind of large-scale organizational system. It's only recently that we've entered into a new kind of culture which refrees the individual human being. It's something to think about. Well, this early agriculture occurs first in what's called the Fertile Crescent, which is Mesopotamia, Tigris, Euphrates, river area, and Egypt, which has the Nile. And we'll talk about the role of these rivers. Obviously, you need water for agriculture. And so we say history begins here, high civilizations begin here. Famous book, History Begins at Sumer, Sumerian area of this. And also, we're going to see a contrast in a couple of weeks when we get to this, where the Nile River is very stable and leads to a very stable, secure civilization. Tigris and Euphrates are always flooding, changing courses. They're building with mud brick because there's no stone, it keeps dissolving the mud. And so we have a very unstable culture, and we'll contrast those. So here's Mesopotamia. When we see pictures of the ziggurat, there are many of them, but the Ziggurat of Ur-Nammu is the key one. It appears to be out in the desert, but in fact, it's part of a city. And the city has dissolved back into mud. The ziggurat remains. And we'll look at Egypt, and we get the Great Pyramids. We'll talk about why did they build pyramids? Why the investment in these efforts? And there are two key Egyptian building types, the pyramid and then later the Egyptian temple. Now, we just happen to have an Egyptian temple right here in New York. So we're going to have a little project, some of our sections, we might go to the Metropolitan Museum, make a drawing of it. How many people have seen this? Great. Okay. If you haven't seen it yet, wait for your assignment. We're going to go there and make a sketch. But you go into the building in the main entrance, in the middle, turn right, and go as far north as you can, and you'll hit it. There's also a fantastic Egyptian collection, which is arranged kind of in chronological order, so it's a beautiful, beautiful collection. So let's pause a minute. Monumental civilizations, high civilizations, I said they're brought about by agriculture, just for the fun of it. People are now questioning that. There appear to be evidences of high civilization before agriculture. So stuff is always a little bit in flux. Is agriculturally based life better than hunter-gathering? What would be the advantage of an agriculturally based lifestyle over hunting-gathering? Correct, stability, security. You grow the food, unless something goes wrong, there's a drought. You grow the food, you know it's going to be there, you can store it, it'll keep, you'll have it, a backup for droughts, it gets you through the winter. American Indians drive a buffalo off a cliff and then feast, and then no buffalo around, they don't eat. So, on the other hand, as I described before, agriculture locks you into, beginning of settled villages, high civilizations, you're now locked into this hierarchical organized life. And does history progress? Are one of these periods better than another? Something for you to think about. We'll then look at Greece, and we see something important with Greece, the emergence of a humanist sense of the human being, that human beings are not just a part of nature, they're not just a part of a big civilization, but they're individuals with minds, imaginations, reason, rationality. And so this is a unique invention. Donald Cromley is going to talk about Greece, and he's going to open with a line from Kidder's book. Donald, something happened in ancient Greece, a unique vision of what a human mind could do and what a human being was for. Is that roughly accurate? Yeah, so something happens. And we still partake of that today. And maybe that's symbolized by the human anatomically highly accurate representation of a human being, interest in the individual human being. And maybe these columns are symbolic of, in the Greek temple, symbolic of the emergence of the individual from society. Now, something just to mention, and that is, I sort of put in a whole discussion here of an idea that I then took out, but let me just briefly describe it. Greece is thought of as highly important. Some approaches see our culture coming about as a confluence of Western European culture, coming about as a confluence of the Hebraic biblical traditions and ancient Greece. And they come together in a certain unique way that leads to Western European culture. Now, that makes Greece important as our ancestors, our heritage. Now you get to the late 1700s when European scholars get interested in this approach, and you get this big argument between the British scholars and the German scholars, who are the true descendants of the Greeks. What about the Greeks? Oh, well, they're Southern Europeans. It's Northern Europeans are superior, and so we're the true descendants. It's a tremendously convoluted way to claim Greece as their ancestry. Then we get to the 1960s and 70s and the Black Power movements in the United States, and suddenly they're claiming not to be the descendants of the Greeks, but to be the ancestors of the Greeks. The Greeks got it all from Africa. We invented it all. They stole it all from Egypt. So everybody's running around trying to claim Greece and rewriting history to make them the descendants or ancestors of Greece. So it's just interesting how suddenly and now, who cares about the Greeks? I mean, does anybody study Greek and Latin? How many people studied Greek and Latin in high school? How many people studied Latin? How many people studied Greek? Well, 200 years ago, that was the definition of an education, studying Greek. So we still interested. So our attitude toward these things changed. Well, then look at Rome. And the first thing we want to say about Rome is Greece is a series of independent nation states, often at war with each other. Rome is one unified empire. So, totally different political entities. And Rome is centered around the city of Rome. It's an empire organized with communication lines, roads, whole governmental hierarchical apparatuses, but also the city of Rome. And cities need water for drinking, sanitation, etc. And so we see Rome walled for protection and a series of great public baths with aqueducts coming in and servicing these baths. So incredible engineering feats. So we'll look at all that, and then with Rome, a total change in the architecture. So to simplify just a bit, in Greece we have the importance of the column. These columns are structural, supporting a lintel. In Rome, the wall is important, and the columns are decoration. Here they are pilasters engaged with the column, or with the wall. So we have this sequence from the Romans will say develop and perfect the arch. We have evidence of arches before Rome, but this becomes key to Rome. So we go from the arch to the vault to the groin vault, and these configurations make possible an interior open space. And so we get an interior architecture. The most famous example is the Pantheon, kind of a Greek temple front, but then a Roman domed space inside. I spent some time on this building. Fortunately, it's still mostly intact. And Last week, Donald showed us the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and the center of it very much comes from the Pantheon. And then the idea of adding these wings very much comes from Palladio. So Donald's going to talk to us about Palladio, and we'll see how these ancient buildings live in our architecture to this day. We don't really build like this anymore, but this is 1941. This is still, well into the 20th century. We're still looking back at this Roman architecture. And then we begin something interesting, and that is the European cathedral form. So we have born, in this period we call early Christian, this idea of a nave, side aisles, a transept, an apse, and this becomes a European cathedral form. And this plays out in a stylistic arc until the 1700s, and then it stops. So that's sort of the European idea. Now, there's actually two of these temple forms. The other one is the central plan, and these two are sort of in dialogue with each other, conflicting with each other, and the architects prefer the central plan just because it's so nifty and symmetrical, geometric, and the church wants the, it's called the Latin cross, because it puts the priesthood in the center of importance and the audience out here. So it's a theological debate. Now, this begins to crystallize in what we call the Romanesque. And I'll say this again when we get to this period, don't confuse Romanesque with Roman. Similar words, two totally different periods. Something interesting happens here. Take a look at the elements of this French Romanesque church. And here we are, so we've got these round arches, boom, 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 boom. So, but this is not Romanesque, it's Romanesque revival. So this is 1872, getting close to the 20th century in Boston, right across from the Boston Public Library. And it's by we call them pioneers of modern architecture. Before the heroic period of Franklin Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier, the pioneers of modernism, Richardson, Sullivan. So H.H. Richardson does this building in this French Romanesque style. And we call this Richardsonian Romanesque because it becomes quite prevalent. So here he is moving away from this church-like quality, but we still have the round arches, and we've got these round arches down here. So this is a building on a campus of Harvard in this Richardsonian Romanesque style. Now, where have you seen a Richardsonian Romanesque building? Are there any in Brooklyn? Hello, you're in one. So this is not Higgins Hall North, but Higgins Hall South is in this Richardsonian Romanesque style, the red brick, the round arches. Here's our arches right outside the coffee shop, just like the ones that Richardson's using. And then you go in there and you look at the stair railing in there. It's exactly our stair railing. Higgins Hall South, main building on the Pratt campus is also Richardsonian Romanesque. So these things come down to us today, but don't confuse Romanesque revival with Romanesque. Two totally different things, hundreds of years apart. And Romanesque, out of Romanesque emerges Gothic architecture, and there's a great called Cathedral Crusade. They built 80 of these incredible cathedrals, huge things. The highest vaults in the tallest cathedral. This is Chartres, not the tallest, but in the tallest one, which is Beauvais, if you put Willoughby Dorm in here, it would still be 20 feet before you got to the under part of the vault. So these things are huge. This is a little town of Chartres, a little walled town, and they accumulate the wealth to build these magnificent buildings. Why'd they do that? So we'll talk about that throughout Europe between around 1150 and 1250. And there's something we might call a Gothic imagination. Gothic architects are very interested in the logic of structure. So the way all of this works, the interior vaults, the forces of the vaults being picked up by the flying buttresses, all come from making the masonry follow the lines of force as they move through a building. So the lines of force, nature, natural forces, dictate the form of the building. And we maybe see that kind of imagination in Calatrava today, one of the more interesting architects, particularly in his bridges. We then get the Renaissance. And so Renaissance means rebirth of what? Classical ideals and ideas. Where in Europe, beginning in Italy, and in the 15th century. So, again, the way we pointed out with Greece, there is no Italy. This is a series of independent city-states or regions, often at war with each other, but sharing a language and a culture and the arts of the Renaissance. And we get a new kind of humanism. So here we are going back just to the Middle Ages, the time of those Gothic cathedrals, and we have a Madonna and Child, very important icon in Christian art. Mary with the baby Jesus. And here, in this medieval version, these are not very anatomically developed human beings. They're kind of spiritual creatures floating in this gold leaf makes a kind of spiritual space. And it's really not clear where they are. They're not in a perspective space. But now with the Renaissance, we develop perspective and anatomical awareness. The baby looks like a baby. The mother has actual identifiable human features. We're set in nature. And so we begin to see the emergence of what we, for some time, maybe no longer, identify as a human being. And that doesn't mean there weren't human beings before. It means the understanding is different in humanism. And on the left is a Greek sculpture, Roman copy of a Greek sculpture, of a standing male nude. And then on the right is a Renaissance version by Michelangelo. We'll talk about this when we get there. And very similar, but there's something different. We begin to get an individual interior psychological character when we look at the features of the face. This is something that develops in Europe with the Renaissance. And here is a famous painting by another major Renaissance artist, Raphael. The three biggies are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So they're the three major high Renaissance artists. And here, how many people have seen the Sistine Chapel ceiling? Anybody? Okay, did you recall this painting? On your way in, you see this, on your way into the Sistine Chapel. So this is by Raphael. It's called School of Athens. And he shows, we're not in Athens because this is, the Greeks didn't build these vaults, but they did, so he's sort of taking these Greek figures and putting them in contemporary meaning his day. And when he paints this, St. Peter's Cathedral that we'll be looking at is under construction. So we have all these figures standing in St. Peter's Cathedral. In the center are Plato and Aristotle, two different great Greek philosophers representing different values, different ways of seeing experience. And around them are artists, architects, poets, scientists, mathematicians. Here's Michelangelo. And this is sort of representative of a term, the Renaissance man, the complete person, all the parts that make up this Renaissance notion of a human being. And then not everybody lived like this. This is a very wealthy retired clergyman, but this is a building by Andrea Palladio, and it's representative of the home for this Renaissance person, where we've got a central dome, no longer a dome of heaven, but where the human being stands, and you can look out front, back, left, right, and so this is a point of reference, kind of Cartesian coordinates for where the human being stands, using these Greek and Roman vocabulary. So they're tying themselves back to Greece and Rome. Then we have the Baroque. We have these ideas we've been talking about, but they become dynamic. And so rather than a round dome, we have an oval dome, which has more energy. We have undulating facades. And the Baroque sculpture of this period is, so here's Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo shows David before the encounter with Goliath. So he's still contemplative, thinking about his strategy. Bernini shows David in the midst of hurling the rock, engaging the space around him. So, contrast, it's very similar theme, but adding kind of a dynamic action to it. In the French Baroque, we've got this axis extending to infinity. So this is Louis XIV's Versailles, and the Great Canal takes these diagonal boulevards, and the central axis extends outward, symbolic of the French Empire. And then we get Rococo, which is sort of like the end period of the Baroque, where we become very dynamic and very ornamented. Now, what we see here, so what comes after the Rococo? And what happens is the arc of the European cathedral style ends and something else begins. Now, what that European cathedral style was, why it ends, every church built after Rococo is in one of the styles we already saw. It doesn't develop anymore. We now get a series of revival styles and then something new. So we'll look at neoclassicism, in which they say, you know what, this Rococo sort of got out of hand, and we should go back to the more clear principles of Greece and Rome. So that's called neoclassicism. You get other people saying, no, we should be open to something new. Well, where does the new come from? The new comes from the inner imagination of the poetic artist. And so in Piranesi's prisons, we're exploring sort of the human unconscious, and a new kind of space is emerging, one that's asymmetrical, complex, and eventually we say modern. With the Enlightenment, we say we can take the rational understanding that Isaac Newton pioneers in science and apply these rational principles to the human condition. And so key Enlightenment figures, a lot of them are American. One of them is Thomas Jefferson, and he designs University of Virginia. So here the idea of a university, the fact that our Jefferson is an architect as well as a political figure, and this layout is meant to better human understanding. We get the emergence of new technology. So here is iron. And so I should contrast this with the heavy stone of the aqueduct. And here we, well, where's the, this is toothpicks. You can't hold up a building. This is the tallest building ever built at the time it was built. You can't hold this thing up with just toothpicks. Well, they can. Totally new approach to material, lightweight, thin members of iron, which then eventually gets replaced by steel. Looking backward during this period, Beaux-Arts architecture, some of it going, as we saw before with the National Gallery, 1941, some of it into the 20th century. So here we are, Metropolitan Museum of Art, which we'll be visiting for our Temple of Dendur. And here we've got use of these Roman elements again, but in a very rich spatial, pardon? Thank you. I corrected it elsewhere. You could, okay. So Hunt does the center and McKinby and White do the wings. So I have the architect wrong here. Art Nouveau. Is it possible to do something totally new? So this is decorative. Look at these curlicues on this stair. But what distinguishes this from everything else we've seen up to this point? There are no historical references. There's no Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian columns. There's no reference to any previous culture. And it's still decorative, but the decorations are totally out of the moment. And then early modernism, and these things, the labels change, but key figure is Louis Sullivan. And something interesting about this building, it's a Chicago school building, even though it's in St. Louis, Missouri. So Sullivan did buildings, even one here in New York, the Bayard building. Is it on Bleecker? I think it's on Bleecker Street. Bond Street. Anyway, we've got one of these right here in New York by Sullivan, and the chief draftsman on this building was Frank Lloyd Wright. So we're sort of moving into our modern era. So next year we'll look at what we call modern architecture, figures like Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Seagram Building right here in New York, Le Corbusier, this is his Villa Savoie, and then opening up a whole, we go right here, this is 1931, so what's been going on for a half century? So we'll sum that up with one building, a Frank Gehry Bilbao, but where are we today? And how does where are we today build from what we've seen so far? So then we'll take a break, but before we do, let's ask a question. What was missing from the presentation I just made? What was missing from this presentation? And, of course, the answer is, this is what we just looked at. From primitive, ancient, all the way to postmodern. What does that leave out? We have a general term for it, non-Western architecture. So it leaves out the other global cultures. Now, there's been a process, the dominant textbook in art history in second half of the 20th century has been, these things are named after the author, has been Jansen. And now, 25 years ago, Stockstad came along, which is the one we use. We use the brief version of Stockstad. And Stockstad is the same publisher, just like Jansen, except it includes non-Western. So most schools still just focus on Western. And then, what I just presented is Western culture. We use the term, it's Eurocentric. Now, we could look at other cultures and take that list that I just gave you, and then when the West bumps into other cultures, include them. So we say, well, during the Crusades, Europeans go to the Middle East and bump into Islam. So then, around, at that point, we have Islamic architecture in our lectures. And then at the 1500s, we start going to the Americas. So we do Meso and South American. And then in the 19th century, there are very strong encounters between Europe and China and Japan. So include them here. And then India becomes part of the British Empire. You see strong relationships between Buddhism and postmodern theory. But again, that makes these other cultures footnotes to European culture. So alternatively, we can look at them each on their own, standing on their own, historically relating to other cultures, but also as entities unto themselves. So that's what we'll try to do in this course. So looking at Islam, begin with talking about the culture and its history, growing up in the Middle East, and the 5 pillars of Islam as taught by Muhammad and his followers. And the first one is submission to Allah. Very important in terms of the self's relationship to the cosmos. And we'll talk about that in the architecture. And it's several other things. Another thing to note is Islamic culture is anti-iconographic. It says in the Bible, thou shalt make no graven image. And maybe that was meant to, you shouldn't make an image of God. But it's a, hang on. I think I didn't turn on my recorder here. No, it's running. Okay, sorry about that. So it's anti-iconographic, so there can't be images of human beings and maybe even of nature, so it becomes very geometric, very strong sense of geometry. While there are many different Islamic architectures in different parts of the world, here we are, the Mosque of the Shah in Iran or Persia. And we just love the geometry of like how these things turn the angle and the rich geometric patterning of the dome. The Ottoman Empire was Islamic and dominated much of the Eastern Mediterranean, was a power, cultural and military power, equal to Europe. But by the World War I, the Ottoman Empire sides with Germany, Germany loses, and the Ottoman Empire is dismembered, broken up into 39 states, many of which are in turmoil to this day. So a lot of what's going on in the Middle East is a result of this. Now, how does the Islamic and other previously colonial parts, let's say European colonies, feel about where they are today? And that is studied in a field called post-colonialism. And the key text in this field is Edward Said's Orientalism, in which it looks at the Western attitude toward these other cultures. So we'll talk a bit about that in the course. And we'll look at pre-Columbian Mesoamerican and South American. So Mesoamerican is Mexico and Central America, and then South America. So Mayan, Aztec, and Incan cultures. They share Quetzalcoatl as a deity. Quetzalcoatl is a dying and resurrecting god. This is the same sculpture, front and back, life and death, associated with the cross and born of a virgin. Does that sound familiar? So we see these patterns, and we get pyramids. So here is Kukulkan or El Castillo. And we're going to see similarities not only to Mesopotamia and Egypt, but other pyramids as well. We'll look at India, and here we have Hinduism. And the Hindu temple is a key architectural form. And the Hindu temple is a three-dimensional mandala. And a mandala is a diagram of the universe, a diagram of the mind, and a tool for putting the mind in harmony with the universe. And so is a Hindu temple. And we'll see how these beliefs can be integrated into philosophy and into everyday life. And then we'll see how Buddhism grows out of Hinduism. In a way, we can say Buddhism is a universalizing of Hinduism. And we associate Buddhism with the Buddhist stupa. And so here's the greatest Buddhist stupa, Borobudur in Indonesia. And we can see how this is a three-dimensional mandala. This is the Western sculpture that we looked at earlier, Michelangelo's David. And here is an Asian sculpture from Java, Indonesia, Prajma Paramita, goddess of transcendent wisdom. And look at, one is kind of psychologically based, and one is trying to transcend individual thought into a meditative mood. So we see how these cultural ideas get embedded in the arts. We'll look at China, and this is maybe unfair in choosing these two examples, but here in this Western painting, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo, the individual person dominates the landscape. Here, people are integrated into the landscape. And we'll see that attitude in China. And in China, the important architecture is built with wood, even though it's a very wealthy culture. And then we have the Needham question. Here we are in the early 1400s. Admiral He builds these great fleets, which set out with 9 treasure ships and 300 other ships, 28,000 crew, with these giant triple-hulled ships with farms, farm animals, huge crews traveling around the globe. This is Columbus's ship. Now, why did the West come to conquer and dominate the globe and not China? It's not that the Chinese lack the wealth or technology. Something else going on. So we should think about what that is. Japan, we have very similar architecture to China, again an emphasis on wood. This is Ise Shrine, which is a Shinto shrine. So Shintoism is sort of, somebody's talking, could you please? Shinto shrine. Shintoism is the native Japanese religion. If you're born Japanese, you're Shinto. And there's, again, this integration with nature. So in Ise Shrine, it's built without protecting the wood, no varnish, and it deteriorates. Here we see green mold growing into the thatched roof, and every 20 years it's rebuilt to renew its spiritual energy. There's another Japanese example, Katsura Imperial Villa, asymmetrical, interpenetration of inside and outside, integrated with its landscape. So let's wind up with a little contrast here, taking two of the buildings we've looked at, Katsura Imperial Villa and Villa Rotunda. So they're both villas for nobility. Katsura was for a prince who was supposed to inherit the emperorhood, and didn't work out that way, so he had to retire, and so he became a poet. So he'd read poetry, write poetry. They built him a villa. He could sit on the deck and look at the reflections of the moon and contemplate nature. Villa Rotunda is for a retired clergyman. Most of Palladio's buildings are working farms. This one's exceptional in that it's a weekend retreat. And so he would come here, read in the library, entertain, and look at how Katsura is integrated with its landscape. Villa Rotunda sits above and dominates the landscape. You can look out and see nature, understand it, and control it. So we could contrast the construction. Katsura is built, we'll see, it's typical of Chinese and Japanese architecture. We have rammed earth podium, stone, column, non-bearing walls, thatched or tile roofs. And this kind of frame with non-bearing walls is going to become very, very parallel to what goes on in modern architecture. Here in Villa Rotunda, we're building with masonry. An attempt at permanence. Fortunately, Villa Rotunda is still with us, but Japanese understand nothing's going to be permanent. And even though in the West we strive for that. Interestingly, Greek columns are made up of cylinders which are stacked one upon another. Roman columns are single pieces. Here, these are made out of brick and then stuccoed over. So they have the appearance of Greek or Roman columns, but they're built much more economically. So all of what we see here on this building is stucco. The plan. Villa Rotunda, mostly symmetrical. Human being occupies the center, looks out in the Cartesian coordinates, the x, y, and then z axes. Katsura, asymmetrical, meandering, integrated with its landscape, interpenetration of inside and outside. So the walls slide open and they're made out of paper anyway, so that there is not this separation of the human being from nature. Now we can look at these contrasts culturally. So in Shintoism and Buddhism, what is the ultimate reality? What is the world made of? Well, let's start over here with Villa Rotunda. So nature is made of material, energy, and the laws of nature. We can understand them through science and technology. And human beings separate from nature and observe, understand, and control it through science and technology. So that's humanism. Seeing the human being as emerged from, separate from, understanding and controlling nature. In Shintoism and Buddhism, ultimate reality is the totality of the consciousness of all sentient beings. It's not material. Material is something that comes from our imaginations. The fundamental stuff of the universe is consciousness of all beings intertwined and interrelated. Human, nature, and spirit are one integrated whole, unlike God, man, and nature as three metaphysically separate things in Europe. So in Shintoism, there is this reverence for nature. It's where we come from, particularly our islands of Japan. And you might find a spot in nature that has a kind of spiritual power. You'll mark it with just this rope in order to establish its importance. Interpenetration of inside and outside. The walls open up, and so the landscape flows in and out of the building. If the doors are slid closed, they're made out of paper, so there isn't this rice paper. So there is not this strong separation. that we try to get our walled-off, protected world in the West. And then we look at Japanese art. This is kind of recent, called modern art. Very famous painting. And maybe you have to look twice before you know, oh my God, there are people here. They don't pop and stand out. They sort of flow in with the forces of nature. In the Villa Rotunda, we stand above, top of the hill, looking out. The human being is an anatomical and individual thing. We've emerged from society as an individual consciousness and an individual anatomy. So around the same time of Michelangelo's David, who obviously knew his anatomy, all these guys did cadaver anatomy, we get Vesalius's studies of human anatomy. And then the, again, School of Athens representing the totality of this emerged human being. Now we have some time, so I'm going to just end with a fun slide. Let's look at the attitudes of these two different cultures. This is a text called the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu is a legendary Chinese figure who is purported to be the author of this spiritual work, the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao is the way. Actually, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching is that the eternal Tao cannot be told. In other words, you can't say what it is, because it's the principle or a way of all things. And this stands beyond our human concepts. And in it, he talks about how we should learn from and be related to nature. And he writes, do you think you can take over the universe and improve it? I do not believe it can be done. The universe is sacred. You cannot improve it. How many people feel that way? No? So we don't do it. Any environmentalists here? Okay, let's look at another book. This is a book called The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. How many people have heard of Ray Kurzweil? So Ray Kurzweil is probably our most important futurist right now. His newest book is called How to Create a Mind. He's works in artificial intelligence, just became chief scientist at Google, so he has all of those resources available to him. So he's really doing it. And he writes in The Singularity is Near, which is about the future, and he observes that the power of computers doubles about every year. And at that rate, eventually we'll have full-on artificial intelligence and humans will merge with computers. And then we're going to go out and spread this intelligence to the universe. He writes, it may only take a quarter of a millennium, 250 years, to go from sending messages on horseback to saturating the matter and energy of our solar system with sublimely intelligent processes. We're going to sprinkle sensors and chips all over the solar system. The ongoing expansion of our future superintelligence will then require moving out into the rest of the universe, where we may engineer new universes. So in the 1980s, physicist named Guth, proposed the idea of the inflationary universe, that the expanding universe began with a period of rapid inflation, but his mathematics imply that if you have enough energy in a big enough basement, you can build universes in your basement. So, where we may even engineer new universes. So here's a book called Programming the Universe. These people tend to see the universe as generated by code. And this is Seth Lloyd, who's a quantum physicist at MIT. This is a textbook on how to reprogram. It didn't get it quite right, so he wants to reprogram the universe. This is a group called 2045. They just had a conference at Lincoln Center a couple of years ago. This is Russian oligarchs who are developing avatars into which they can download themselves in case, so they can be immortal. And then this is a project called Timeship that I mentioned I'm the director of research for. And this is a research facility for cryonics, for freezing people so you can thaw them out at a time when all this is possible. So what term occurs to you when you read something like this? How about hubris? I mean, these people are just off the chart. Very different attitude from these people. So something to think about. How do you feel about nature? Is it something we should respect? Is it something we should alter? And different architectural traditions have been approaching it differently.